On November 19th, 2011 at 3:48 a.m., a driver came across something gruesome on his foggy morning drive. Jaleayah Davis's body was found in the passing lane of the highway near mile marker 181, about 800 feet away from her car. The engine was still idling and all the doors were locked from the inside. The clothing and crime scene didn't add up, and the more information that was released, the more questions that everybody had. Jaleayah's death ruling was highly controversial, and many still don't agree with it to this day. Today, we're going to talk about what seemed to be missing from the crime scene and what didn't seem to add up. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you will see why so many people are still haunted by Jaleayah's story. Welcome to the True Crime Nurse, everybody. My name is Kat, and I'm a registered nurse who loves all things nursing and true crime. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell before you go. All right, my friends, let's get started on today's case. Born on November 2nd, 1991 in Colorado Springs, Jaleayah Rose Davis was a beautiful young woman that was vibrant and had this almost electric presence about her. By the time she was 20, she had become the heart of her family in Marietta, Ohio. To her mother, Kimberly, she was a fierce protector and constant companion. To her sister, Tabi, she was a best friend and a confidant. Jaleayah was the kind of person who commanded the room with a sharp wit, a loud, infectious laugh, and a signature style that often featured her favorite color, purple. Jaleayah attended Marietta High School, and she grew up in Mid-Ohio Valley, where she was known for her loyalty and her refusal to back down from what she believed was right. She had a passion for doing her makeup, styling her hair, and curating outfits that made her feel powerful. This wasn't about vanity. She loved the expression of it, and she felt truly beautiful. Jaleayah's friends described her as a firecracker and someone who was incredibly warm to those that she loved, and she also had this no-nonsense filter that could be intimidating to people that didn't know her. In 2011, she was navigating that rough transition period between high school and then into her early 20s, working and spending time with her friends and going out in the Parkersburg and Vienna areas of West Virginia. In the months leading up to November, Jaleayah had started hanging out with a new group of friends, including Kristen Bechtold. Her family noticed a subtle shift in Jaleayah during this time period. They kind of got this sense that the group dynamics were maybe more competitive or tense than Jaleayah's typical friend group, but despite that shift, Jaleayah remained the caregiver of her household, always checking in on her mom, and she maintained that deep protective bond that she had with her sister Tabi. On the evening of November 18th, when she began her routine of getting ready for the night out, there was no sign that this would be anything other than a typical Friday night out that she would usually have with her friends. She put on a dark-colored shirt, jeans, and her favorite white double-breasted pea coat and stepped out into the cold night, leaving behind a family who expected to see her back in bed safely by morning. Jaleayah met up with her friends, including Kristen Bechtold, Freddie Scott, Jordan Fox, and Katie Nelson. For a few hours, the group went out to their familiar places, including the Grand Central Mall and a local bar called The Locker Room. This seemed like it was another group of 20-something-year-olds going out on a Friday night, but beneath the surface, something went wrong. Witness accounts from later on that evening began to paint a picture of a night that had turned sour, with Jaleayah appearing increasingly isolated and distressed as the group moved from the local bars to a private house party. That house belonged to a man named Brian Saps and is located in Vienna, West Virginia. At this house party, they were all drinking and initially having a great time, but the vibe shifted from lighthearted to hostile. The key issue, which has become a very important aspect of this case, was that an argument erupted at the party. A power struggle started over Jaleayah's car keys then too. Reports say that members of the friend group were concerned about Jaleayah's ability to drive, while Jaleayah, who was very independent and perhaps feeling ganged up on, adamantly refused to hand her keys over. This was a loud, tearful confrontation that left Jaleayah feeling betrayed by the people that she was supposed to be out having a good Friday night with. By 3 a.m. on the 19th, things got even worse. Jaleayah had felt targeted, later telling her sister that these people were not her friends. The final 20 minutes of Jaleayah's life were a frantic blur of phone calls, and she was filled with fear. At 3:28 a.m., Jaleayah called Tabi, and Tabi heard her sister in a full-blown crisis. She was sobbing, and she pleaded for her sister to come get her. In the background, you could hear the voice of Kristen, and she was sharp and snappy as the two women continued to argue about their location and what would happen next. Some people feel that Kristen was only trying to keep Jaleayah safe by not driving, but what Tabi heard painted a very different picture. Her sister felt no longer welcomed or safe in this friend group. Jaleayah managed to tell Tabi to meet her at a gas station nearby, but that never happened. The call then cut out. Jaleayah managed to keep her car keys despite the fight and ended up behind the wheel of her own car. Sometime after 3:30 that morning, Jaleayah drove onto Interstate 77 North. Kristen was reportedly in her own vehicle nearby. This began a high-speed drive through the darkness that ended abruptly at mile marker 181. Whether Jaleayah was being chased, distracted by her phone, or if someone else was in that car with her still remains a mystery in this investigation. By 3:48 on November 19th, so just 18 minutes later, a truck driver called 911 to report a bundle in the road. But this wasn't a bundle. This was Jaleayah. As his headlights swept across the pavement, he realized that he was looking at a human body, and he immediately reported that to the 911 dispatcher. When the first responders arrived just minutes later, they were met with a scene that was not only horrific in how violent it appeared, but also confusing with how the layout was. Jaleayah's body was laying in the middle of the highway, and she had suffered catastrophic trauma that included decapitation. And yet, somehow, the surrounding evidence did not match your standard high-speed car accident. Something felt off. Keep in mind, first responders see traumatic incidents on the highway frequently, so the fact that they felt something was off is very telling to me as a nurse. Once investigators arrived and began to process the scene, the first major anomaly that they encountered was the placement of Jaleayah's clothing, which seemed strange for a car crash. Several feet away from her body, draped over a guardrail post, was her white pea coat, her shirt, and her bra. These items were not shredded, and they were not scattered across the asphalt like typical debris when someone's ejected from a car. Instead, they appeared to be gathered in a way that the Davis family would later describe as neatly stacked or placed. The white coat, which Jaleayah had been wearing when she left the house that night, was shockingly clean, given the fact that it was involved in such a violent accident. This led to immediate questions about how a body could be thrown from a vehicle with enough force to cause decapitation, but somehow the clothes were draped and fairly clean on a post. Just north, or approximately 800 feet from where Jaleayah was, the car was still in gear and the engine was running. When the deputies approached the vehicle, they found that the doors were still locked, which was yet another puzzle piece for a scene where their driver had supposedly been ejected. The driver's side airbag had deployed, but the passenger side had not, and the passenger side window was shattered. The exterior of the car showed sideswipe damage along the passenger side, meaning that the vehicle had scraped along the guardrail for a considerable distance before finally coming to a stop. The inside of the car added even more layers to this mystery because investigators found Jaleayah's cell phone and other personal items still inside the vehicle. There was a noticeable lack of blood spatter within the cabin too, which some forensic experts found very unusual for a decapitation occurring during an ejection through a window. We will definitely be talking more about this later on in the autopsy portion of today's case though. The official police theory centered around the idea that Jaleayah, who was not wearing a seatbelt by the way, had been thrown across the interior of the car as it impacted the guardrail at a very high speed. They guessed that as she was being forced out of the passenger window, her head struck the sharp, narrow edge of the guardrail post with such force that it acted as a blade. The friction and force of the ejection happening simultaneously must have stripped the clothing from her upper body. This reconstruction, however, did not sit well with the first responders or the family who arrived later on and saw the final scene. The distance between the body, the clothing, and the final resting place of the car created quite a bit of evidence that just felt disjointed. To the authorities, the 800-foot gap between the body and the car just was from momentum, and the car continued to roll, but Jaleayah's body had stopped upon impact. To those who knew Jaleayah, though, the scene looked like a stage and a series of deliberate placements designed to look like an accident. This was all while hiding the reality of what happened in the minutes after she told her sister that her friends were not who they seemed to be. She was afraid of them and she was being followed. So, could they have played a role in her death? The official autopsy report from the West Virginia medical examiner was completed, but they didn't release the results until March of 2013, so about a year and a half later. When those results had finally come out, the primary cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma resulting in decapitation. Jaleayah had also sustained a broken leg, internal organ damage, her right chest was missing, and she also had extensive abrasions from road rash, which occurred when her body made contact with the ground. The toxicology report confirmed a blood alcohol content, or BAC, of 0.19%. This was used in the state's theory to explain why a young woman might have lost control over her vehicle on a relatively straight stretch of highway. Next, they needed to decide if this was an accident or could this have been from some type of foul play. The argument for an accidental death rested entirely on a theory of centrifugal ejection, which is a rare but specific sequence of events. According to the state's experts, as Jaleayah struck the guardrail and began to grind against the metal, the car did not stop. It sprang and vibrated violently. We already touched on this, but to elaborate more, they argued that because Jaleayah was not wearing a seatbelt, that initial impact threw her toward the passenger side of the vehicle as the car's passenger side of the window shattered and it hit the guardrail, and the momentum supposedly threw her body out of the narrow opening. The state felt that her neck was caught by the top edge of the guardrail post, resulting in the fatal injury. They also felt that being pulled through a broken window and caught on metal would be enough to remove a coat, shirt, and bra and right side of her chest from her body. But the condition of the clothing remained a massive point of contention. Private investigators and independent medical examiners hired by the Davis family said that for clothing to be ripped off during an ejection, we should expect to see significant tearing, stretching of fabric, and most importantly, heavy blood staining and tissue transfer. Instead, the white pea coat was found in a condition that many argued was far too clean and intact to have been a part of a decapitation. There was also an absence of certain defensive wounds or typical crash injuries that we should expect to see if a driver had braced herself for impact. But I will say that that may be caused by the alcohol, though, because she was a little bit more relaxed. The family's legal team raised questions about the lack of glass shards embedded into the skin of her torso, which is common when a body is forced through a shattering window. There also was an issue on the car's interior. While the state argued that the decapitation happened at the window's edge, the lack of a blood trail or high velocity spatter inside that door panel was seen as a huge sign that the injury may not have occurred exactly as the reconstruction suggested. The medical examiner ruled the manner of death as accidental, which means that the state believed no human intervention caused Jaleayah's death after she got behind the wheel of the car. To the investigators, she had a high BAC, high speeds, and no seatbelt that led to a freak accident. But to the Davis family, the autopsy was a collection of data points that simply didn't add up to the scene that they saw at mile marker 181. They remained convinced that the physical trauma to Jaleayah's body, combined with the impossible placement of her clothes, pointed more towards a scenario where she was either out of the car before it crashed or was removed from someone else. Now, to look at Jaleayah's autopsy through a clinical or at least a nurse's lens, I want to talk about specific details of how a human body reacts to trauma. The medical examiner's report immediately raised questions regarding the mechanics of injury, at least for me, especially about what you should see in an ejection. I have cared for patients that have been ejected from cars, so there are a couple of things that I do want to touch on. The way that the investigators presented their theory of how Jaleayah was ejected in comparison to her clothing seems to be a little off to me. The human body is tacky and creates friction when being ejected from a car. For 3 layers of clothing to be stripped simultaneously from a body would require a level of precision that trauma almost never sees. We can typically expect to see degloving injuries, severe skin abrasions, or friction burns where the clothing was ripped away, and yet the descriptions of her torso did not show the type of shredding seen from fabric being forced off by metal and glass. The injury to her chest alone seems almost surgical in a way, and also doesn't seem to add up here. When it comes to the decapitation, the state's theory is that her neck hit the guardrail post like a blade. The neck is reinforced by the cervical spine, various muscle groups, and tough ligaments. To achieve a clean decapitation, rather than an internal decapitation where the spine snaps but the skin is still intact, requires a massive amount of force. I'm not saying that this is impossible, but while a guardrail post can act as a shearing force, we would also have to look for the spatter pattern or the trail of the event. If the decapitation happened at the window's edge as she was being ejected, the carotid arteries and jugular veins would have immediately released a high volume, high pressure spray of blood in a clear path beginning at the window. In a trauma bay, this would cover everything for a 3 to 5 foot radius. However, the reports from the scene said that there was a surprising lack of high velocity arterial spray inside the passenger cabin or on the interior door panel. And remember, the first responders themselves disagreed with this finding because the first responders in the field know that there should have been arterial sprays present and where at. Another clinical red flag involved the cleanliness of the white pea coat. Blood is one of the most difficult substances to remove, but it travels easily. If Jaleayah were wearing that coat at the moment that her head sustained that injury, the collar and upper shoulders of that coat should have been saturated. The fact that the coat was found pretty neatly and was clean enough to still appear white and recognizable to the first responders means that this was a pre-mortem or post-mortem removal of the coat. They felt that it does not align with the mid-crash ejection. Something else that's concerning is that unknown DNA profiles were found on that coat. Some people have wondered if maybe they were picked up throughout the night on the jacket when she was going out and partying, but the Davis family feels that this wasn't pursued in the way that it needed to be. Now, to move on to her mental state. While a BAC of 0.19% can explain impaired reflexes and judgment, it does not explain the lack of glass shards in her skin. When a body is pushed through a shattering window, the skin usually acts as a sponge for thousands of tiny diamond-like shards of glass. These are usually found embedded into the dermis or caught in the hair and clothing from an accident. If the autopsy found a lack of these microscopic glass stings on her upper torso, then it suggests that she may not have gone through the window as it was breaking. This leads us back to the haunting question of whether the trauma happened exactly where and how the state said it did, or if Jaleayah was already in a state of crisis before the car ever touched that guardrail. Now, to go back again to the investigation, there seemed to be a divide that grew wider with every passing day. On one side stood the Wood County Sheriff's Office, which viewed the scene as a tragic but straightforward accident, and on the other side stood the Davis family, who saw many gaps that they felt crossed the line from oversight into negligence. Those initial hours of the death investigation are the most critical, and the Davis family said that the golden hours of Jaleayah's case were wasted on them assuming that this was just a drunk driving accident. One of the most obvious gaps called out by the family was the way that Jaleayah's car was processed. Her car was not immediately impounded and processed like we typically see in potential homicide cases. Kimberly Davis has frequently pointed out that the car was released back to the family far sooner than expected, leaving them to discover their own evidence. Once the family regained access, they found items like hair and fiber samples that hadn't been fully analyzed. To this day, I haven't seen any reports that what they found was tested by the police. Also, the fact that the car's doors were found locked from the inside as the engine was still running was explained by police as a fluke by the electrical system, but the family said it was impossible if Jaleayah had been ejected. This is a safety feature that should not happen. The passenger seat of the vehicle looked untouched, and there were no deep scuff marks on the dashboard where a body might have hit too. Equally alarming is the fact that there was a blood smear towards the top of her car on the outside, on the driver's side, and a moderate amount of blood on the lid of the trunk that didn't seem to make any sense at all. And this has been heavily debated by the public as to how it got there. The police don't seem to have a documented explanation for theories of how that got there either. In the era of 2011, though, social media and cell phone records were becoming the new DNA, and the family said that the phones of the individuals present, like Kristen, Freddie, and the others, were not seized or searched like we would typically see in a homicide investigation either. Jaleah's phone was recovered, but her frantic calls to Tabi were treated by the investigators as the ramblings of a drunk person rather than someone who was genuinely terrified. That 20-minute window between Jaleah's last call and the 911 call from the truck driver was a black hole that the police failed to fill with GPS data or pings from cell towers on the cars that could be involved too. That is incredibly important information that would have either supported or shut down foul play in this case. As Jaleayah drove, her phone pings created a map of her final movements. While the state viewed her path as a straight line, the family investigators saw something more unsettling. The timing of the data pings showed a journey that wasn't just a panicked flight home, but it was a sequence of movements that needed to be looked at further. If another vehicle was chasing her, let's say, the cell towers would have captured a second set of pings moving in sync with hers. For years, the Davis family has stressed that a tower dump was never done. A tower dump is when the investigators take a look at every phone active at mile marker 181 at the time of the accident. Again, this could have provided vital information that could have either proven that Jaleayah was being chased or if someone was there with her or not. Now, I want you to think back for a moment to that 328 phone call, the one that she made to her sister. Tabi said that this wasn't the voice of someone just driving under the influence. She genuinely felt trapped and afraid. The sounds of her sobbing, interrupted by the demanding voice of Kristen in the background, made it clear to Tabi that there was an issue between the two of them going on that night. When Jaleayah told her sister that these people were not her friends, she was drawing a line in the sand just minutes before her life ended. I don't say this to assume guilt on anyone's part, but this should have been a lead for the police to treat this as a homicide and rule things out as the investigation progressed instead of leading this investigation as an accident. There was sufficient reason to look into her friends that night, but that didn't happen because it was immediately treated as an accident. As the weeks of this investigation turned into months, the communication between the sheriff's office and the Davis family broke down completely. The family began hiring their own experts, including private investigators, accident reconstructionists, and independent medical examiners who began to find all of these gaps that we've been talking about in the state's logic. These holes and concerns weren't coming from the family, they were literally coming from experts. For example, their experts argued that the damage to the car's rim and the specific scrape on the guardrail didn't align with the body being thrown out of the window at the angle that the police suggested. Every time the family presented these discrepancies to them, they felt that they were met by a wall by the sheriff's department. These points from hired experts led to a lot of scrutiny from the public. The failure of the state to provide a timeline that could account for every minute of the night led to a decade of speculation, leaving the Davis family to act as their own detectives, advocates, and forensic technicians. They had to balance grieving their daughter and sister with fighting against a system that they felt had decided Jaleayah's life wasn't worth a thorough investigation, all because she had been drinking that night. Because the medical examiner had officially checked the box for accident, the progress in this case came to a complete halt. In the eyes of the Wood County Prosecutor's Office, there was no crime to prosecute. So, without a homicide finding, there were no warrants to be issued, no grand juries, and no suspects to be questioned under oath. This left the Davis family in limbo, where they were forced to fight for more answers on their own. It's sad to say this, but we see this often in cases like this, and I wish that that was not the case. A woman named Ember Stafford began making waves online by claiming that she had been an eyewitness to the murder of Jaleayah Davis. She gave quite a bit of detail about what happened on that dark stretch of the highway, and for a brief moment, it seemed like a breakthrough for the community that they had all been waiting for. However, after an investigation into her claims, the Wood County Sheriff's Office determined that she had fabricated her entire story. Stafford was arrested and charged with falsely reporting on an emergency because of it. This was a devastating blow to the case because it gave the Davis family hope for more answers coming, and that was immediately shut down. The Facebook page Justice for Jaleayah had become a hub for thousands of people who felt that this story didn't make sense. The Davis family explored every single possible avenue you could think of, including civil litigation, but the burden of proof in these cases matter a lot To win a wrongful death lawsuit, they would also need a solid alternative theory that could be backed by experts willing to testify in court, and they needed evidence. While they had several experts who doubted the state's version, the accidental ruling protected everyone else involved that night. By the time the case was officially closed in March of 2013, the legal proceedings had resulted in 0 answers for the family and only 1 conviction, but of a woman who lied about the case. Today, the case still remains officially closed, but Kimberly Davis continues to fight through the Justice for Jaleayah movement, keeping the evidence in the public eye and hoping for a confession or a new breakthrough, possibly in DNA testing, that may identify those unknown profiles on her clothing. Jaleayah's story lives on through a dedicated community of people who refuse to let the West Virginia hills paint this solely as an accident. Kimberly Davis continues to speak her daughter's name with the same fierce protection that Jaleayah once showed her. Jaleayah's funeral was held at the end of November 2011, and it was a beautiful reflection of the impact that she had on the Marietta and Parkersburg communities. The service had the color purple everywhere, which, if you forgot, is her favorite color, and mourners wore black and purple with purple ribbons and scarves and ties in her honor. On the anniversary of her death, November 19th, family and supporters usually gather at mile marker 181 to honor her. Jaleayah, Taubby, and Kimberly and the rest of their family are in my thoughts and prayers, and I pray that Jaleayah is resting peacefully. Let me know your thoughts on today's case, and if you feel that this could have been an accident, whether you feel this was a thorough investigation or not, and any other thoughts that you have, because I have so many questions still. Thank you so much for spending time with me today, and I hope that you feel extra loved and special this week. Don't forget to take great care of yourselves, nurses' orders, and also don't forget to drop our secret handshake in the chat if you made it this far in this video. I will see you guys next weekend.